Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to my August wrap-up. Today I'm going to be telling you about all the books that I read in the month of August. So I read 12 books in August, and I will start off as I usually do in my wrap-ups with some classics. So I read one work of Victorian fiction in August, and that was The Notting Hill Mystery by Charles Warren Adams, which was a really interesting read. So this is a kind of early work of detective fiction from the 1860s, and basically the kind of conceit, the premise of this book is that it is a collection of papers and sources and, pieces of evidence collected by an insurance investigator. So this man works for an insurance company, and then he has been charged with investigating a particular unusual circumstance where a man has claimed life insurance after the death of his wife, but he had a lot of life insurance policies out on his wife's death, which seems very suspicious. So the rest of this book consists of various different pieces of evidence. So we have, letters and diary extracts and kind of people's accounts and descriptions of what they saw, and it kind of all comes together into this mystery novel, I guess. I always find it really interesting to read early mysteries because there are certain elements of this that you can see have kind of influenced later works of mystery fiction, but also the mystery is kind of obvious. It seems like it's quite clear early on what the investigator thinks happened, and then we're just seeing all of his evidence for his assertion, so that's kind of interesting. It's a slightly odd mystery in itself. I really enjoyed it, but the logistics of the mystery would not really hold up to modern standards, I would say. It's very implausible, but I still really enjoyed this, and I found the narrative form especially fascinating. It was also very interesting to think about it in kind of comparison to Wilkie Collins, because it reminded me quite a lot of both The Moonstone and The Woman in White, and it was actually published in between The Woman in White and The Moonstone, and I kind of love the idea that maybe Charles Warren Adams was influenced and inspired by The Woman in White, and then Wilkie Collins was in turn inspired by this for The Moonstone. I feel like that's a kind of fun thought. I also kind of wish I had read it before I filmed my Victober announcement, because this would be another great read for my challenge for Victober this year, which is to read a work of Victorian literature that plays with form in some way, because this very much plays with form, as I said, lots of different perspectives. I will say that because of the format of it, you don't really get to know the characters very well. It's very much a kind of form and story driven book rather than a character-driven book, but I still really enjoyed it, and yeah, always really nice to read some Victorian detective fiction. And then another classic I read this month was this short story collection, Standing Her Ground, classic short stories by trailblazing women. So this is one of the kind of Pam Macmillan Collector's Library editions, and this is a collection of various short stories by women from, I think, mostly the 19th and early 20th century. So this was an interesting collection. I had read a few of the stories in it before, and some of them I hadn't come across before. I think my favourite story in it that I hadn't read before was The Other Two by Edith Wharton, which I really, really enjoyed. I thought that was a fantastic short story. Unfortunately, there is a really big misprint / error in the middle of this book. So the second short story in here is The Manchester Marriage by Elizabeth Gaskell, which I have read before. And I read it again because I really love Elizabeth Gaskell, and I was on the second page, and I was suddenly that doesn't really make sense. I don't really understand what's happened. And I just felt like something was missing. And so I went and looked up The Manchester Marriage on Gutenberg, and basically a good 2 pages have somehow gone awry and not been included in the short story. And it literally moves from one sentence to a sentence 2 pages later, mid-sentence, mid-paragraph. So it's just really confusing and makes no sense. And as far as I can see, all the rest of the short stories seem fine. They all seem to make sense. But I felt very sad that there was such a massive error in the Elizabeth Gaskell story, because it's a fantastic story and I love Elizabeth Gaskell, and it seems a shame that some people will read this book and think that Elizabeth Gaskell is a confusing writer, whereas actually there's just pages missing. And I, checked on Goodreads, and some other people had said this too, so isn't just the error in my edition, like something obviously went wrong with the production of this book, but that kind of really bothered me. So I really enjoyed some of the short stories in here, especially the other two by Edith Wharton, but I'm not sure I'd recommend this collection because, as I said, there is an error in it. And another short story collection I read in August was this. This is Frenzied Fiction by Stephen Leacock, and this is a Canadian short story collection from 1917, and I found this really, really fun and really interesting. It kind of reminded me actually of like early Dickens, you know, like Sketches by Boz and that kind of thing. Like it's got this really like journalistic style. I guess with the exception of like one or two stories, it mostly feels like the narrative perspective and the narrative voice is kind of the same character, and it often kind of looks at like aspects of life. There's lots of like satire, I guess. I think one of my favourite short stories was one called The Sorrows of a Summer Guest, where the narrator is talking about how he's been invited to spend a month at a friend's house for the summer, or an acquaintance's house for the summer, and usually he says no to all of these invitations, but this time, in a moment of madness, he said yes, and now he has to spend a month with people who he hates, and he just hates being at someone else's house. And it was just very, very silly and very, very entertaining, and I found the ending hilarious. In general, the humour was really, really great in here. Like, I found these stories very, very funny, and you know, some stories have aged better than others, but in general, I thought the humour was great, and I really enjoyed these. And actually, although the collection in general was really funny, the final short story in this collection, Merry Christmas, A Christmas Story, obviously, was actually really moving as well. And it's kind of a Christmas story about like the impact of the First World War. As I already said, these short stories were originally published in 1917, and some of the stories do talk about the First World War and some stories don't. And I actually found it really interesting to read like a Canadian perspective on the First World War, because I feel like everything that I have read about the First World War is very much like about Britain and France and Germany, and it feels very like present, whereas a Canadian perspective on the First World War, the war is happening, but it's really far away. And that was kind of like a very different view of the First World War, I guess. It just felt much less like immediate. So I kind of found that really interesting too. So yeah, overall, really enjoyed this collection. Definitely would recommend it. And then I also read two works by Agatha Christie in August, one of which was a play, Black Coffee, which is a Poirot play. I do have a physical copy somewhere, but my husband Nick borrowed it. He's reading it now, and I don't know where it is right now. But I really enjoyed reading Black Coffee. It's a fun play. Like, I don't think that you can do quite as much with a murder mystery in a play as you can do in a novel, but I did enjoy Black Coffee. I thought it was done well. It's a play that features Hercule Poirot. There is a gathering at a house, and some documents have gone missing, someone dies, lots of drama happens. I really enjoyed it, as I always do with Agatha Christie. So basically, Nick and I have been working through the Hercule Poirot books in publication order for ages, and we had skipped Black Coffee because it was a play, and we've been listening to the books on audiobook, but I wanted to catch up and read the play. And then also this month we carried on with our reading the books in publication order, and we listened to Dumb Witness from 1937, which we really enjoyed. Agatha Christie is just great. I think she writes amazing, amazing characters, and I think she's very good at creating characters who you don't like, but you like something about them. Like, she's very good at creating a lot of kind of slightly awful people, but also you do feel sorry for them. It's called Dumb Witness because there is a dog who features quite heavily in the book, and maybe the dog would know something, but he, you know, cannot speak his evidence because he is a dog. I quite enjoyed the dog. That was good fun. I feel like people who like dogs will really enjoy this Agatha Christie book. Basically, the setup is that there is an elderly woman who's very wealthy. She has two nieces and a nephew, who all kind of want more money, and are looking to inherit from her after her death. And one day, when all the family are staying with her, she falls down the stairs and she thinks to herself, I don't think this was an accident. I think something weird is going on. So she writes a letter to Hercule Poirot, but through various circumstances, the letter doesn't get delivered until sort of a few months down the line, after which she has already passed away from seemingly natural causes. I really love Agatha Christie a lot. I just think she's great. And Nick and I really enjoy listening to Agatha Christie on audiobook together. Usually the audiobook's narrated by Hugh Fraser. So I definitely recommend this one. A really great read. Then moving further into the 20th century, I also read a kind of children's modern classic from the 1960s, Oversea Under Stone by Susan Cooper. This is the first book in the Dark is Rising series, which I know that Alice from Alice and the Giant Bookshelf really loved. And Alice passed away a few months ago, and I kind of wanted to read something that I knew she had loved. She also loved Agatha Christie hugely as well, actually. So I read lots of things this month that Alice really loved. And I really enjoyed Undersea Under Stone. It's a really fun, atmospheric children's book. Basically, these 3 children have gone to Cornwall for the summer with their parents, and they're staying with a family friend, Great Uncle Merry. And in this mysterious house that they're staying in, they find a mysterious manuscript which may or may not lead to the Holy Grail. So lots of kind of like King Arthur, magical fairy tale vibes in the background. And the book follows these 3 siblings trying to kind of solve the treasure map. And of course, there are, you know, some bad guys who may be trying to get hold of the Grail themselves. I just really enjoyed this. I thought it was a really good fun, really like atmospheric and enjoyable. And I really enjoyed the dynamics between the siblings. I think my favourite was Barney, who's the youngest child who is underestimated by his siblings. And he was really fun. So I just really enjoyed this, and I'm looking forward to reading on with the rest of the series. Moving from classics to contemporary literature, I also read a rom-com this month. I read Happy Place. I really love Emily Henry. This is the 3rd book by her that I've read, and I've just really enjoyed everything that I have read by her so far. I've been listening to her books on audiobook, and basically I've been getting them out from my library, and I just basically have Emily Henry books continually on hold because there's often a very long wait list, and whenever they come in, I try and fit them in and listen to them. So I listened to Happy Place in August, and I really, really enjoyed it. So Happy Place is a kind of like second chance love story, I suppose. We are following Harriet, and she and a man called Wynne were together for a very long time. They were engaged, and then they broke up 5 months ago, but they haven't told their friends yet because they are part of a very, very close-knit group of friends that has kind of been drifting apart as they have got further into adulthood, and both Harriet and Wynne kind of feel that their breakup will be like the nail in the coffin for the friendship group. Like, if they tell everyone that they have split up, that is the end of all of those friendships. Every year, their group of friends go on holiday together to one of the friends' like family beach house, and this year they're going, and Wynne has made an excuse not to go. Harriet's going to go spend the time with her friends and tell them the truth about what's been going on, except she gets there and Wynne, her ex-fiance, is present because 2 of her friends have decided that they are going to spontaneously get married, and therefore they want all of their friends there to have a private wedding with just the 6 of them, their kind of most important friends. And Harriet and Wynne now feel that they cannot possibly ruin their friend's wedding, and therefore have to pretend that they are still a couple. I know that I've heard some people say that they just found the premise of Happy Place really unbelievable, but to be honest, I just like completely went with it, and I feel like the friendships felt so real and the group dynamic felt so complex and messy that I believed the situation. I feel like what I love about Emily Henry's books is she has a really good balance of like great love story, lots of really good romance, but also like a lot of other life stuff too. Like, there's a lot about like work and jobs and friendships, and how friendships change as you get older, and family stuff and kind of family complications, and all of that kind of stuff I just thought was done really, really well in Happy Place. The book is kind of told through alternating sections, some in the present and some in the past, and the past sections are all called Happy Place, and there's something very like tragic about the past being your happy place, and that kind of like got me a little bit every time. I just thought it was really great. If I were to rank the Emily Henry books I've read so far, I feel like People We Meet on Vacation would probably be at the top, and then Book Lovers, and then Happy Place. But to be honest, I really have loved all of them, and I just think she's a fantastic writer. So that was another great read in August. Then I also read 3 works of historical fiction in August. One was actually my own book, The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hearst, which I was listening to on audiobook. So I started listening to it on audiobook in July when the book came out, and then I finished that off in August. There's usually like 6 months plus between you reading like the final page proofs and the novel coming out, and that's actually like a decent amount of time for you to like fall out of love with something you've written. So it was really nice when The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hearst came out to listen to it on audiobook and just remember that I do really like the book. So I started listening to it on publication day on the 18th of July, but I ended up, you know, prioritising other things and then finishing it off in August. And yeah, I just really enjoyed listening to it because I really love Olivia Vinall, the narrator. I think she's done such a fantastic job with the audiobook, and it was just so nice to read the book and remember that I really like it. So that was very nice. And then I read a historical mystery, Cabaret Macabre by Tom Mead. This is the 3rd book in the Joseph Spector Locked Room mystery series, and I really enjoyed this, as I have the previous 2 books in the series, which are Death and the Conjurer and The Murder Wheel. They're just really great fun. So this is a historical mystery series set in the 1930s, and they're all locked room mysteries. And there are 2 recurring characters, one of whom is a police officer and the other of whom is a person who he consults often, who is a former stage conjurer. So he is very good at illusions, and therefore he's really good at solving locked room mysteries and seemingly impossible crimes. So in this book we have various impossible crimes that Joseph Spector is called in to solve, but the book kind of begins with Inspector Flint being contacted by someone who says that her brother is in danger from another man, and meanwhile Joseph Spector is contacted by the other man's wife to say that that man is in danger from the first person who got in touch with Inspector Flint. So they're kind of like initially being put on opposing sides of some kind of mystery, and this all ends up culminating with Christmas at a country house and some mysterious deaths. I just thought this was great. I really enjoy Tom Mead's books, and I really love like the tone he writes with. They're just really wry, clever, fun puzzle mysteries. So yeah, I'd really recommend Cabaret Macabre. And I've actually done an interview with Tom Mead talking about his books and about classic crime and kind of Agatha Christie and kind of the classic crime authors that have inspired him. So that may be up before this, in which case I'll link it down below, and if not, it will probably be the next video that you see on this channel. And then I also read The Bookbinder of Jericho by Pip Williams. This was my historical fiction book club pick over on my Patreon. I have quite conflicted feelings on The Bookbinder of Jericho. So I read The Dictionary of Lost Words by Pip Williams a couple of years ago, and I absolutely loved it. Like, one of my favourite books of all time. Truly fantastic book. And I remember thinking when I read The Dictionary of Lost Words that it was one of those books that packed so much in. Like, I just couldn't really believe that Pip Williams had managed to pack so many themes into it and so much into it, and yet to pull it off so spectacularly, and it worked so fantastically. And I kind of feel like The Bookbinder of Jericho also has a lot packed into it, and it doesn't quite manage to deal with all the themes quite as well. So The Bookbinder of Jericho is set during the First World War in Oxford, and we're following a girl called Peggy who works in a bookbindery, and we're basically looking at how the First World War affects her life, especially when lots of Belgian refugees come to live in Oxford, and when Peggy starts volunteering at hospitals. I think a lot of the sections of the book about the First World War were really powerful and moving. I thought those worked really well, but I kind of struggled with Peggy a bit as a character. I didn't really like her that much, and maybe I wasn't meant to, I'm not really sure, but I especially struggled with her relationship with her sister Maud. So Maud is her twin sister, and Maud is probably autistic, it's not specified, but the way Peggy behaves towards Maud and their relationship, Peggy is kind of quite patronising towards Maud, and there are moments where you can certainly see that Peggy is maybe seeing that and learning from it, but at other moments that kind of fell a little bit short for me, and I feel like Maud was mostly a plot point for Peggy rather than sort of like a fully developed character in her own right. Basically, I kind of struggled with Maud's presentation and with Peggy as a character, and I know quite a lot of other people who were reading along for the book club did as well, and I think that is partly because this book was exploring so much and it didn't quite have the time and space to do justice to everything, and I think that was a particular shame with the character and presentation of Maud. So that kind of left me feeling quite like conflicted about The Bookbinder of Jericho. I definitely did not love it in the way that I loved the Dictionary of Lost Words. And then I also read 2 non-fiction works in the month of August. So one of these was A Gentleman of Uncertain Fortune by Rory Moore, How Younger Sons Made Their Way in Jane Austen's England. So I started reading this in July for Jane Austen July, and then I just didn't manage to finish it in the month of July, but I did finish it off in August, and I really, really enjoyed it. This was a fantastic social, cultural, economic history of the younger sons of the gentry and the aristocracy in the late 18th, early 19th century, and kind of what jobs and professions were open to them. So it's basically like a history of work, and specifically a history of like middle and upper class work, and a history of professions, I guess. And that was just really, really fascinating. It was a really, really interesting book, really easy to read and accessible. Nice mix of like primary sources and, you know, the examples and details of real people's everyday life with kind of the broader, more zoomed out stuff. And I just found it really, really interesting. So I'd really recommend Gentleman of Uncertain Fortune if this is a time period that interests you. And I can't wait to read, I think it's called Love and Marriage in the Time of Jane Austen by Rory Moore, which is his newer book, which I'm sure will be really great too. And then finally, I also read Unruly by David Mitchell, which I listened to on audiobook. And the subtitle of this is The Ridiculous History of England's Kings and Queens. So David Mitchell, if you don't know, is a British comedian and journalist, and I've always really enjoyed his work as a comedian, and I've read his kind of collections of newspaper articles and his autobiography before, and I was interested to read his book Unruly, which, as I said, is a history of England's kings and queens, and it is very specifically of England's monarchs rather than Britain's monarchs. So it goes from like mythical kings such as King Arthur through to Elizabeth I. It stops after Elizabeth I, after which point England and Scotland shared a monarch. And I found this really interesting. It's a really fun history. The tone is very wry and kind of poking fun at the ridiculousness of the monarchy in history often, and I really enjoyed that. David Mitchell has a great, accessible, fun writing style. I also found it very interesting to read a history of England's kings and queens from, as I said, as far back as we may have had kings and queens here, to Elizabeth I, because that is definitely like before my main period in history. Like I'm definitely an 18th, 19th century person. So there was a lot in the kind of medieval period that I didn't really know, or that I did kind of know, but only from like Shakespeare plays rather than from like actual history. And it was kind of interesting to like piece together some of the things I did already know with more knowledge. As I think I've said before, when it comes to history books, I'm in general much more of a like social, cultural history person. And this kind of like political, royal history doesn't really interest me as much. Like if this book had been written by someone else, not David Mitchell, I wouldn't have really picked it up because I'm not super interested in reading about the history of the monarchy and the history of royal people. Generally, I just think the non-royal people are more interesting. However, I really like David Mitchell a lot, so I wanted to read this, and I did find it really, really interesting, so I definitely would recommend it. Good fun and well worth a read. So those are all the books that I finished in August. I did also read a chunk of Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens, which I'm listening to on audiobook. But I didn't finish this at all. I read like a quarter. So I'm behind on the Mega Dickens read long, which is very sad. For the first time in nearly 2 years, I have got behind. So I need to finish reading this off in September, as well as reading September's book, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. But, you know, that's okay. I have read this like 7 times before, so, you know, it's not the end of the world. But it's fantastic, as it always is. It is, you know, my favourite book ever. So that's what I read in August. Do let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. Otherwise, that's all for now, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.